It's wonderful to welcome all of you here. My name is Peter Lowen, and I'm the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. And it's my real pleasure to be hosting and welcoming JoséeTouchette for this event today on the OECD, on the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. I do want to start by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. It has for thousands of years been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. I know I and my colleagues at the Munk School are grateful and appreciative, and we feel very lucky to be able to work and to thrive and to play on this part of Turtle Island. This is a wonderful event, and it's a wonderful event because it's a partnership between Munk School Boyden and the Toronto Global Impact Network. So I'm going to just take a second to invite up Eric Meerkamper, who's going to say a few words, and Alan Pescador from those two organizations about our guests today. And I'll ask you to join me in welcoming them with a very appreciative round of applause. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Meerkamper. Just 2 minutes. I'm just going to talk about this. Hey, Christine. Sorry, I didn't want to call you out there if she comes. I'm with the Toronto Global Impact Network. Just started this. It's been 3 months ago. So we're moving in real time. We have a logo. Thank you, Alain, for putting that together. So it means we're official. I know a number of people here who are a part of it. Essentially, what we are just a network of people around the idea of, what role can Toronto have in the world to have a larger positive impact? And, when you think about different cities, if you travel much and you think about places that do a good job on a city level of having a positive impact, you might think a DC or a Geneva or Berlin or Montreal for that matter. Toronto isn't necessarily, but I know there's a lot of stuff that we are doing, we can do. And I think there's not just an opportunity, but maybe an obligation for us, at least not even punch above our weight, even punch to our weight. I don't think we're there yet. We're all probably in violent agreement here in this room, which is great. And so what we're first trying to do is just starting to create a bit of a network. The actual idea of a network of people who can actually interact. That's what we're thinking Toronto, right? So it's something we can get together and share ideas. So that's the first thing. If you're on LinkedIn, hopefully you are, go to Toronto Global Impact Network. You can join. We're going to have, just growing this group of people and recommend our people as well. The second thing is just facilitating conversations like this one. So it's great to be a part of it. We'll have other ones going forward as well. So that's really where we're at. Please do come and join us. And with that, I'll bring on Alain, the co-founder, to tell a little bit about our speaker.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Well, first of all, Josée, Daniel, welcome to Toronto. Thanks so much as well to the Munk School, to Peter, to Jill, to Sarah, who have been incredibly helpful in helping to organize this gathering tonight. It is really institutions like the Munk School who play a significant role in helping think about the opportunity that Toronto has to have an impact in the world, as Eric was mentioning. One of the most sort of interesting things about my work, I'm in executive search, is the fact that I get to meet with just fantastic leaders from all over the world, and Canadian leaders from all over the world. And I happened to reach out to Josée a few months ago, and she was so generous because she immediately jumped on the opportunity to be able to provide referrals for a search mandate that we were undergoing for the University of Ottawa. And so I learned that she has a very important job, that she's Canadian, that it's probably a very stressful job, and that she was going to be coming to Toronto and to Ottawa, leading a mission to understand what Canadian public and private institutions are doing when it comes to their inclusive recruitment, their diversity, equity, and inclusion from their recruitment practices. And that's just an example of the role that Toronto can play, and that Toronto institutions can play in influencing global organizations into perhaps attaining some of the thinking that we live and breathe here in the city when it comes to diversity. So that is the impact that, as Eric was mentioning, through the Toronto Global Impact Network, we're trying to ignite these conversations and just bring people together to think about the role that Toronto can play internationally. And so with that, it's a pleasure to introduce Josée, who not only has now global impact through her work, but who also spent 30 years in the Canadian Public Service, most recently if I'm not mistaken, she was the CEO of Canada's National Energy Board. She also was instrumental in leading the efforts around the Canadian International Development Agency. And so, Josée, on behalf of the Toronto Global Impact Network of Boyden, and welcome to the Monk School. Thanks, Josée.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, thank you so much for your warm welcome. I too want to say that it's very important to acknowledge the First Nations who are here before us and on whose lands we are today exchanging. It's always a great privilege to think that we come and are part of that greater chain. So that's really something that I think is really important to signal and to say. And I also want to acknowledge the importance of the Monk Center. The Monk Center is really a beacon when it comes to public policy in Canada. And I think that it has a very important role, a very important responsibility, and it is displaying that because it is thoughtful, it is thinking about different issues, and I hope that today I can, in my very small way, help you continue some of these processes and studies that you are doing. So I have a few slides. And we'll kind of go over them. My talk is kind of divided in three parts. First, I want to talk a little bit about what the OECD is. Then I want to talk a little bit about multilateralism today at a time where there are many challenges to multilateralism and where trust in institutions and trust in international institutions is being challenged from very many different places, right? Then perhaps you might be interested to hear how you might be able to work eventually at the OECD. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. Now, let me start with the OECD and who we are, what we do. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has 60 years of history and experience in ensuring that governments work together to find evidence-based solutions to common challenges. It's a unique international organization because it develops global standards and it defines best practices in almost every field of economic and social policy to promote better policies for better lives. That's our motto. And it's really interesting because when you talk to people at the OECD, whether you're talking to the Secretary General or you're talking to the person at the front desk who greets you in the morning, people are truly united by that mission and that purpose. And they understand that their impact is really the combination of the multiplier effect that everybody in the organization working together can have. The original purpose of the organization was after the Second World War, where it was there to administer American and Canadian aid as part of the Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Europe, with one stipulation. Countries had to work together to decide how to allocate and prioritize resources. Anytime you talk about resources, there is always going to be very vibrant discussions. And those discussions around allocation and prioritization will have impact beyond the moment that you decide, sometimes for the very long term. Since then, our membership has expanded. It started with European countries, Canada, and the US. It now comprises 38 member countries and 5 key partners that represent about 80% of world trade and investment. And we still operate by consensus. A consensus decision is not always easy to get to. Think about having 38 people around the room with very different interests sometimes, yet we always say that, you know, at the heart, we have common values. Nonetheless, we might have very different views on certain topics, and any decision requires consensus. So on any given day, you are going to have to persuade, to convince, and those skills become very important no matter what your job is in the organization. In parallel, our vocation at the OECD is expanded to improve. It has also expanded. We are there to improve the economic and social well-being of people around the world by advising governments on policies that support resilient, inclusive, and sustainable growth. We work by bringing together member countries and partners that collaborate closely on key global issues at national, regional, and local level. Through our standards and initiatives, our work helps drive and anchor reforms in more than 100 economies in the world, building on our collective wisdom and our shared values. Now, a few numbers here. 38 member countries, 80% of world trade and investment, 4,000 conferences every year, 5 billion data points, 500 major reports every year, and 450 international standards that are developed. Our global reach, you can see here, really extends throughout so many different ways, places, and people. And the most recent accession country has been Costa Rica, of which Daniel is a national. So really, really happy to have one person from the original founding members and our newest country being represented here today. And in terms of what we do, this is how we shape better lives. This gives you a couple of ideas. I want to draw your attention here on the number of 600,000 students. These are people that are evaluated across 79 countries and economies through the PISA system. So many of you throughout your academic cursus will have gone through, so I see heads nodding, through these tests. And this is really, really important because countries rely on that and compete on that basis. And every time a student in Ontario is going through those tests, it's thanks to the OECD. So it gives you a sense of what we do. Our Secretary General is Matthias Cormann, and these are his priorities, and I'll be talking a little bit more when I talk about multilateralism, what those mean in our everyday work, if you wish. So now that you understand a little bit about what the OECD is, you might still wonder, why does that matter? And frankly, when you look at the world today and you're in a global affairs center, I'm not giving you any breaking news here by saying that the world today faces very significant and growing challenges that require global cooperation and action. We're meeting today at a time that is a very, very challenging moment in our shared history. Just short of a year has passed since Russia began its unprovoked, unjustifiable, and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, while we were still dealing with the scars that were left by the pandemic. This war has caused and continues to cause great pain and suffering, obviously in Ukraine, but when you think about it globally, energy and food markets have been severely disrupted and confidence has declined sharply. Inflation has surged and global economic growth has slowed down, curbing real incomes and spending, and fueled in particular by higher commodity prices. At a time when the world is still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, governments have to continue to respond to short-term pressures while facing certain long-standing and pressing structural challenges. And as we respond to those short-term pressures, which are very real, we must also remain focused on structural reforms and structural challenges. So for example, we want to make sure that we're securing the green transition to net zero. We want to optimize the digital transformation. And Lord knows, I mean, in the academic world, you know what chatbots are creating. And, you know, these are just some of the examples of what that means. We want to respond to the challenges posed by population aging. We want to rebuild fiscal buffers and resilience. So many of those current vulnerabilities, risks, and structural challenges can only be solved through effective global cooperation. Now, it's interesting because as we are living this, and where so many of us recognize the need for this global cooperation, at the same time, what we are seeing in many of our societies is actually people looking inward and fear gripping people, and therefore distrust being fueled. At the OECD, we believe that we not only have the capacity, but also the expertise to play a central part in helping to find effective global solutions to the evolving challenges of our time. Why do I say that? I say that because it's grounded in experience. It's grounded in experience. For example, in the 1970s, we are the ones who developed the polluter pays principle. More recently, we've helped broker a historic global agreement to make our international tax arrangements fairer and work better in an increasingly digitized and globalized world economy. And in the future, through our inclusive forum on carbon mitigation approaches, we're planning to facilitate a globally more coherent and better coordinated approach to climate action. We're ready to continue contributing solutions to shared global challenges, and we're working with governments and stakeholders to optimize the strength and the quality of the ongoing recovery from COVID-19 while responding to the economic and social impacts of the war in Ukraine. You can just imagine how challenging those situations are and how our member countries are really grappling for solutions. When they come to the OECD, it is in many ways a safe place, and it's also a place of innovation. So you're able to actually learn from what others are doing, and it's a place from which you can then persuade both within your own governments for those better policies for better lives, and also globally to be able to develop some of these global solutions. So we work with our members to rebuild a labor market after COVID-19 that's going to offer more sustainable, rewarding, and good quality jobs for all, supported by gender equality, as well as promoting social cohesion and solidarity. We provide leadership on climate action to help ensure global net zero by 2050 in a way that is effective and fair. We need to turn commitments to net zero emissions into tangible outcomes in a cost-effective, economically responsible, and publicly supported way that doesn't leave people behind. And that's especially for those in jobs, sectors, and places where the transition may be felt hardest. And we know that Canada obviously is one of those countries. We recently established a major new initiative for an inclusive forum on carbon mitigation approaches, which helps facilitate an evidence-based multilateral exchange of information about the different policy approaches around the world to reach net zero emissions. So really, by sharing policy experience, being able to accelerate that transition so that people can actually use lived experience of others and accelerate what's happening in their own countries. Obviously, we also continue to work with our members to reduce emissions, to increase climate resilience, to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to fight pollution, to use natural resources more sustainably, to phase out environmentally harmful subsidies, and to eliminate harmful plastic waste. Multilateralism and cooperation are also crucial to ensure the digital transformation that occurs with management of the associated risks, challenges, and disruptions. there is a need to ensure that models of digital and technology governance are fit for purpose, and practices and policies that can shape the trajectory of this transformation are collectively constructed to support and advance value-based and human-centric standards. We also help to ensure well-functioning global markets and a global level playing field with a rules-based trading system in a good working order. That sustainable expansion of global trade and investment is one of the most important drivers of further economic development and better international economic relations. And we need to push back against the forces of economic nationalism and protectionism while making sure that the benefits of trade are widely and fairly shared. And that's hard. And, you know, you just have to look at our membership. You can imagine some of the very tense conversations that have to happen for that to eventually continue, build a more resilient and sustainable global value chains and systems. So the OECD obviously seeks to be a force for good, and it's our core belief that we work better when we work together. We act as a hub for the discussions of global policy issues, interacting with governments, international organizations, parliamentarians, the business sector, trade unions, academics, media, and NGOs. In doing so, we leverage our position to build an unprecedented network of knowledge that's based on a deep-rooted conviction about the benefits of multilateral cooperation. So for us, that issue of trust is at the heart of what we do. And obviously, we're very concerned about the fact that, you know, this can easily be lost in a world like the one we live in today, where distrust can be fostered and can be an epidemic that runs so very quickly, given, you know, the internet, social media, and all the forces at play that we know. Talked about our approach, and it's really by convening, by identifying innovation and effective policy solutions, and really about sharing based on evidence, and really, you know, using that evidence to create trusted sources of comparative socioeconomic data and analysis that allows us to then anchor policies that are anchored in that data and analysis. Now, what if you're someone who thinks that this is exciting and says, I'd like that to be part of my career path? So just in case, as an employee of the OECD, you have an opportunity to conduct and contribute to high quality research and policy advice, and to help the organization achieve its goal of better policies for better lives, as well as be part of a very stimulating and challenging working environment. It's a fast-paced environment. There's always something, there's always a new issue, and there just aren't enough hours in the day to be able to do everything. So you've got to be someone who's really, on the one hand, really good at being self-driven, self-initiating, but also really good at collaborating and working across functionalities, across different cultural lenses, and be attuned to all of these different ideas, lenses that can contribute to enriching the policy dialogue. Our workforce is diverse, it's multicultural. We have colleagues from across our 38 member countries, including Canada, obviously, and beyond. Staff come from a wide range of academic and professional backgrounds, from policy experts and economists to corporate functions like the ones that I had, and administrative support. The range of professionals who work at the OECD is very, very vast. We are constantly looking for talented and committed individuals of diverse backgrounds and expertise. In our efforts to contribute to a fair and inclusive world, we strive to provide a workplace where everyone feels like they belong. A core strength of the organization is our employee diversity. This not only allows us to attract and retain the best talent from all cultures, identities, and abilities across generations, but also creates a healthier and more productive organization, which is associated with better decision-making, increased innovation, and most relevant policy outcomes. I also want to specifically highlight a few corporate programs that those in the audience might be interested in addition to our current vacancies, all of which are available on our website. And that truly is the case. Every single vacancy goes on the website, and we tell all of our member countries they are there. So it's, available to anybody in your country. By all means, look. But there are some very interesting programs which for students might be of particular interest. So the first one I want to talk about is our internship program. It's designed to bring highly qualified and motivated students with diverse backgrounds into the OECD to give successful candidates the opportunity to improve their analytical and technical skills in an international environment. It's a very competitive program. We get a lot of interest in the program, and we hire about 600 to 700 interns every year. They represent a sizable and critical part of our workforce, and they contribute substantively to the OECD's work. The internship program is open on an ongoing basis, and students have to be enrolled in a full-time degree program, whether it's a bachelor, a master program, or a PhD, during the entire duration of their internship in a field or discipline related to the work of the OECD. We look for quantitative and IT skills, excellent drafting and communication expertise, and the ability to work in a multicultural and international team environment. We recruit interns on an ongoing basis, as I said, and applications are accepted throughout the year online. The other program I want to mention is a little bit different. It's called the Young Associates Program, and it's a unique 24-month program that's designed to expose recent undergraduates to the world of multilateral policymaking, research, and analysis. Our next round is opening later this month, and it's designed to act as a springboard for these students to target future postgraduate studies at top-ranked universities. So you have to be able to demonstrate how you're motivated to use your experience at the OECD to then pursue either a master's program or a PhD program following the completion of the Young Associates Program. A key component of that program is mentorship. So during the 2-year stint that you do at the OECD in the Young Associates Program, you're closely mentored by your manager, and they're selected based on their professional experience, their policy expertise, and their ability to work with, challenge, and develop young, talented individuals. Needless to say, this is a program that, will have maybe 24 of people every year, Daniel, and therefore highly subscribed. So you have to be able to demonstrate really, really clearly how your studies, the work of the OECD, and your future studies all intersect. But, there are very good Canadians who have made it through, and why not you? So we're always looking for talented people. We're always looking for people who share our values and who are convinced and driven by a purpose organization. So when we talk about better policies for better lives, like I said right at the beginning of my talk, it is something that unites each and every one of us at the OECD. We talk about that. We are there. We know we're there for that. And, I'm responsible for corporate services. The accountants on my team talk about that. The people in HR talk about that. Our IT people talk about that, and really want to make a difference to enable the organization to pursue that policy work because we realize what a difference it makes. And we would love for you to be part of that. So thank you. And if you want to learn more about the OECD, you have all of these different places to look to. And really, you know, think about it.
So I get the pleasure of asking a few questions and then
I have
turn.
to get on this chair,
Yeah,
which
do you want,
at my
do you want a
height
hand?
is
Okay, yeah.
it's a bit of a challenge. Here we go. No,
Okay,
got
okay.
it. I'm good.
All
Thank you.
All right. Let's not wobble. We don't want to fall over.
No challenges. No chair is too high for
no
the
chair-
OECD.
No chair is too high for the OECD.
Would you like some water?
Well, you're the chief operating officer of everything. This is fantastic. I've got a few questions, then I'm going to turn it over to the audience for questions. When it comes to your turn, I'd ask you to stand up if I choose you and just give your question loudly. It will be picked up by the microphone up there. And a reminder that questions end in an interrogative, and they're best asked when they're short. I have 3 sets of questions to ask you. One is about the mission of the OECD in these current times. I want to talk to you about talent and you know your role in recruiting talent for the OECD. And then I wanted to actually ask you a couple of personal questions about your work at the OECD.
Not my age.
Not no, I don't want to. Starting with the mission of the OECD, I want you to talk more about. You brought it up, but what's the organization thinking about these issues of trust and credibility? It's a really interesting time in that data is cheaper than ever and easier than ever to get, and we're really awash in it. And there are all sorts of super interesting sources of data that are out there, like Our World in Data, which aggregates a lot of OECD data and other data. There's private firms that are collecting massive amounts of data. And then there is, at the same time, real issues of people having distrust of official organizations, this idea that I can know better than other people and I can draw my own conclusions. How is the OECD tackling this kind of double challenge of not having the comparative advantage necessarily in data anymore that you had, plus people not really trusting organizations the way they used to?
Peter, that's a great question, and really at the heart of so many of our preoccupations right now in a place like the OECD. So let me answer with give you a 3-tiered answer. The first is that from a policy point of view, we have people who are dedicated day in, day out on the issue of public trust in governance writ large. What do these people do? Through their committee work. So at the OECD, what you have to know is that all of our work is based in committee work that brings together experts in those areas from our 38 member countries. And they meet, virtually, and we're coming back to the in-person meetings twice a year to be able to talk about the policies that are needed, the work that's needed, and how to make that progress. So we have a committee that is dedicated to public trust in governance, governments, and institutions, and that is diving into that and always updating their work. So very much a live preoccupation. Then you talked about data. So we are also very concerned about the data that we depend on that comes from the 38 governments that we work with. And we want to make sure when we're doing that, that our statistics and data directorate is able to access the best data possible, the most current data possible, and that it's able to treat it in confidentiality, because increasingly that is an issue that our governments are faced with, and they want to make sure that if they share data with us, that it is treated with the right parameters and the right protections. So that conversation starts with our statistics and data directorate, but very quickly takes us to that 3rd tier, which is located in my directorate, and that is around cybersecurity. So I can tell you that we have, because of the pandemic, had to switch over in 10 days an organization that was receiving every year hundreds of thousands of people to a virtual organization, and we all had to do that within 10 days, and we did not skip a beat. However, what I had to do was to increase cybersecurity in such a way that we were protecting the data, but keeping the organization open, because our power lies in our ability to convene. So you have to go back in terms of that public trust to think about the policy, the data that this policy relies on, and what are the controls that you want to put around that while not destroying your way of operating, which for us is about convening. So that's how we do it.
Interesting. I mean, it seems to me that you live on a knife's edge because you rely on countries voluntarily giving you this data. And for small slices of the data which have market sensitivity, if you ever lost the trust of your partners that you couldn't protect those data, and then it was affecting trade or other public markets, then pretty quickly the whole thing falls apart.
That's right.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Let me ask you about work in international organizations, and I ask you this actually also as a former Canadian public servant. Who are you still a Canadian public servant?
No.
Working for the OECD, so you're officially okay. You're not seconded. You're with them.
No.
So there's a big thing in Ottawa, of course, about whether people are going to come back to work. As nice as it is to work in downtown Ottawa, come back to work in the office. Of course, everyone's working at home. But how does the OECD think about this? Because it's an interesting organization that it's drawing people from around the world, but there must be people at the OECD who are simply saying, why do we all have to be here in Paris? Why can't we just have people across the globe spread out across 100 different work sites? What's that conversation like right now?
So, again, it's a conversation that has multiple levels when you're in an international organization. Obviously, we have a huge initiative around the future of work. And that really is something that, it's our employment and labor and social data directorate that's leading. There's also our digital and technology and innovation directorate that is very much involved in that. And they're thinking in terms of what are the policies for the future of work? And that clearly is something that we draw on. Now, our workforce, like any workforce in the world, has tasted what it's like to be able to have a lot more flexibility than what we used to have. And in a place like Paris, you have this thing that's called a strike. And the strike happens very often. So you got to be ready to, brave the elements and the lack of metro or the lack of, the streets being closed to get to work. And that was part of the equation for a lot of people in the traditional workplace. So now, we're kind of thinking, okay, how do we accommodate that and really take advantage of hybrid as much as we can? But we are in an international organization. So we have an expatriate population. And if you're an expatriate population, you have immunities and you have benefits that come with that. So people will say, well, if you're having those benefits and those immunities and privileges as an international public servant, you shouldn't be working from your country of origin. Or, if I buy a place in Morocco and kind of, once in a while from my screen wave and say, hey, I'm so hot here, but I'm working really hard. So it's balancing that as well. And, we have to administer those rules. It's also an organization that, much like a university, plays that convening role. I keep coming back to that, but it's really at the heart of what we do. And you can do a lot of that through hybrid, but the informality that comes from meeting as we do here and being able after this to chat. I mean, we are going to make connections that may lead to all sorts of things that would not have happened had we been on a Zoom call. And that, is as American Express would say, priceless. And it's true.
So when you're thinking about talent, and one of the things you're really responsible for is talent at the OECD, I want to ask you about two different types of people. You're looking at a 25-year-old graduate student
Yep.
who wants to come and work in Paris, and they're a U of T student, so they're very smart and driven and ambitious, but they're at the start of their career. Or you're looking at someone in the middle of their career who wants to leave a public service or maybe leave the corporate sector to move into the OECD. What are the most important things people bring to the table in those roles?
So that's a very good question, Peter. And what I say to people is I say, in a knowledge-based organization like the OECD, obviously, substantive expertise is very important. So you have to be serious about that. And regardless whether you're a 25-year-old coming out of university or you have your PhD, you're a world-class expert, you have to have that passion for the topic that you're being hired for. So that is really, really important. However, increasingly, what we look for is T-shaped talent. What do I mean by that? I mean people who have that deep expertise, but who are able to see how things are connected. And to be able to see how things are connected, but often in a way that you wouldn't think about it. So where the innovation comes from is to say, I'm drawing all sorts of connections and, really getting people to think about that and say, what is it that we can extract here that will allow us to actually move forward and leap forward? So we look for people who, as I said, are self-starters, but who are also very much able to work collaboratively. The OECD is a place that's very active, that is very, we're always responding to our members' needs. And in a context like this one, post-pandemic, and with a war literally at our doorstep, what we need are people who are agile, who are able to respond to these challenges, and who are prepared to work quite hard, because it is very demanding. And the responsibility that we have as we're driving for these standards and these policies for global application, you can't make too many mistakes, and the impact is really important.
Was it hard to leave Ottawa and move to the 16th in Paris and work at the OECD?
I think he's being ironic.
No. So let me ask you the question a bit differently, which is you had a very remarkable career actually in Ottawa, 30 years. I think 14 of them as an assistant deputy minister, worked on some really difficult files. What was it like working in the Canadian Public Service, and and how did that translate into being at the OECD? What are the differences that are important? What are the things that you brought from Ottawa to Paris?
So, it's funny how different experiences then lead to something else. And you get to a point and you say, you know what, that was really hard, but thank God I went through that really difficult experience, because it's helped me with this. And when you're working in the federal context, you're constantly working in an FPT dynamic, right? So federal, provincial, territorial. And obviously, whether it's healthcare, whether it's trade, whether it's Indigenous issues, these are complex issues that require really, really complex, delicate, layered policy approaches and programs to be able to find solutions. So having had the privilege really of working on Canadian unity, of working on Indigenous issues, of being the ADM responsible for communications at Defense when we were in Afghanistan, huge responsibility, but it makes you realize that, you are able to tackle multi-level issues, multi-level problems, wicked problems, and to be able to then look at it laterally. So it was quite funny, because when the pandemic occurred, and my previous job wasn't from Ottawa, I was actually coming from Calgary to go to the 16th because I was at the National Energy Board. And, we were dealing with Energy East, we were dealing with Keystone. So needless to say, politically charged, right? And very much having a safety culture angle because you don't want a pipeline to blow up because lives are at issue. So when the pandemic started, it was quite interesting because my colleagues who are policy people, very, very capable, didn't have the background of handling a crisis like that, which is what I was trained to do. So I could see that they turned to me and, how are we going to do that? And my teams behind me brought that, and together we were able to help the organization pivot and not miss a beat as the pandemic was ravaging the world.
So that experience of working in, you worked in one of the only areas of the federal government that actually delivers anything, Indigenous services, really.
Yeah.
Federal government otherwise relies on the provinces to do things.
Absolutely.
So you've got this remarkable experience of decentralization and reliance on other people actually following through on the things that you need, right? Which is essentially is the OECD model, right?
Exactly.
The vast majority of the data comes from the countries.
And I would say, Peter, sorry to interrupt, but I would say that as Canadians, we often don't realize just how much persuasion and convincing we have to do to be able to get to results. And that is a skill that we don't realize we have, and that makes us very effective in those settings. We're also kind of unassuming people. We don't come with a big national ego, and we just come in and do it. So I think that also is something we don't realize we have.
I want to ask you one more question about sort of gender and the public service in the OECD. And I just, before asking it, I want to note that if we'd been here 5 years ago, Sylvia Austri would have been sitting right in the front row.
Yes.
Because she was a great friend of the Monk School. For those of you who don't know, Sylvia was a public servant who was at one point the chief statistician of Canada, the first female one, I think the first female deputy minister in Canada, and the most senior Canadian woman at the OECD ever, except for now. You would now hold that title. You've been in the public service for some time, and for all of our students, but especially our female students, what have you seen in terms of changes? What lessons have you learned? And what kind of wisdom can you impart about being a woman in a very, very senior role in a very important organization?
So what I would say is that there's always, things can always be better, but they are so much better than they were. I'll give you an example. I was a young lawyer in the early 90s, and I was working at the Competition Bureau, and it was fantastic. I was on this great big case that actually changed competition law in North America, the Laidlaw case, if you look it up. But I remember walking in the office one day, and we had this boardroom that had 2 glass walls, so you could always see what was going on in the boardroom. And I walked by, and all the competition law lawyers are there with the director of our legal unit. And I'm kind of thinking, why are they there and I'm not there? So after the meeting, I went up to the director, and I was very young and very bold. And I said, that was a competition law meeting? Yes. I said, well, why wasn't I there? And I might ask that question differently today, but I was so insulted. And he said, well, it's because you don't have experience. And I said, well, how am I supposed to gain experience if I'm not in that room? So from that moment on, he was really careful with me. And but things have changed. You no longer see that. Now, what's it like, and why do we have to be, we can never sit on our laurels on some of these issues. And this morning we had the great privilege of meeting Sabine Hirji, who was with the RBC and is now with Deloitte. And what she was saying is that she's noticed that throughout the pandemic, and now that things are starting again, she says, what I'm observing is that at lunch, it's men who are in restaurants, not women. Why? Because women are choosing to stay behind and to do the hybrid work from home. And if you do that, you're self-excluding from a bunch of things. So how do we find that balance? And I think that that's a question we always have to ask ourselves. What I see is that now men participate so much more and are equal partners very often in child rearing, in education of children, in domestic tasks. That's very true in Canada, where policies have had a huge impact. I remember when the federal government introduced the policy whereby women were going to get a year of maternity leave. And I'm not proud to say that I kind of wondered how that was going to work, what we were going to do, if we were going to be able to replace women fast enough while they were on maternity leave. What I saw and what I observed is that after a few years of this, it changed the whole dynamic, because men were seeing their role in child rearing as being much more important. You then had men saying, I have to stay at home because my kid is sick. And it no longer was an issue. And now we have parental leave. We no longer call it maternity leave. And it's shared by partners. It's now a year and a half. It's shared by partners. It doesn't matter if it's 2 men, 2 women, a man and a woman. So I look at that and I marvel at what Canada has done. However, you go to Europe, it's 4 months and it's for the woman. Men get 2 weeks. So, you kind of go, wow, we have done so much. And now, I see it as my responsibility to start a conversation in a place like the OECD to say, how can we make it better? It's going to take time, but that's how you actually get those things going. So policies matter. And then what we do as women is really important, because we need to make sure that we embrace, we include, and that we're also thinking about those who come after us. So there's a real role to be played there. And I think it's equally true of so many different diversity dimensions, right? But I've seen a huge evolution in those 35 years. And thank goodness.
You're on the other side of the glass now, for sure. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I'm pointing to you. Yeah. Stand up and just shut it up. Yeah.
Great. Hi, my name is Jocelyn Mackey. I'm co-CEO of Grand Challenges Canada, mom of 3, stepmom of 2. Thank you so much for your comments. So my question is about the waning trust in multilateralism. And what would your advice be to those of us in the room who believe in the multilateralism system, believe in its importance, but honestly know that there are room for improvement and lots that can be done, but believe in the system? What would your advice be for our role to rebuild some of that trust? We're not in the WHO or other organizations, but we have a role to play. And so what would your advice be in our role to help build back that trust?
Thank you so much. That's a great question. And you're right, we all have a role and we can all play a role. And very often we don't realize the impact that we have. You are coming from the Monk School. That is a brand that is so powerful. Why is it so powerful? Because it's anchored in real deliverables that have created a reputation that is absolutely deserved. So when somebody from the Monk School speaks, it matters. And so when you are speaking, I think that it's important, as you say, not to be Pollyannish and present multilateralism as the answer to everything. But I think by the same token, it's important not to be so critical that you contribute to the distrust. And I think that sometimes what we do and we tend to do is to focus on what needs to be fixed. Yes, it needs to be fixed, but let's not lose the baby with the bathwater. So what I would say is, as you are contributing to a conversation, talk about what's evidence-based, what is working, point out what needs to be improved, but don't dwell on the issues, because you're feeding the arguments that others are going to make anyway.
The questions, ma'am, please.
Hi, thank you first of all for this fantastic conversation, really enjoying it. And also thank you to the organizers, Ellen, Eric, Jillian, and others. My name is Andrew Sultana. I'm the Director of Youth Leadership and Policy Advocacy at Plan International Canada. One of the things that struck me in the presentation is around the different priorities of the Secretary General, specifically around global engagement. I'd be curious, what is exciting you about that priority, and what would you encourage us in the room to be looking forward to?
Thank you. So, you know, what is exciting about that is that it's exciting and it's scary at the same time, right? Let's not lie about it. But when you think about the concerns that we see, that we have, the challenges that we faced, I mean, look at what happened to supply chains and value chains after the pandemic. Then you add on a conflict in Europe that is very real and is having an impact on energy in Europe that is having us, you know, turn down everything to 19 degrees. Let me tell you, in an old building, you really feel it. And, you know, you also think about the hardening of positions in what used to be a multipolar world and is becoming more and more polarized, more and more internal looking, and where protectionism all of a sudden is becoming very real again. So when you look at global engagement, it's to continue, you know, what we talk about very often is to say, how do we just keep the conversation going? And our role as conveners is to keep the global conversation going amongst policy experts and talk about solutions so that we don't get to a place where there are no forums anymore, and therefore we become more entrenched in some of those views and the problems become more intractable. So we really feel that we have a huge responsibility that way. But going back to Peter's first question, if we miss a step on trust, on our data, on cybersecurity, we are going to be taken back. So it's both very exciting, but you feel the weight of the responsibility. And certainly, you know, on my shoulders, when I think of things like cybersecurity, you know, it's not if, it's when you're going to have an attack, and you have to be ready. So it's really, really something that, you know, you're constantly thinking about that engagement, and at so many different levels. And never underestimate the level that you're interacting at. If you think that, you know, what you're doing is, yeah, but you know, the scale of what we're doing isn't that big, never underestimate that, because what you're doing now will have multiplier effect. And the connections in today's world are immediate, they're instant, and they can have a very, very broad reach. So don't underestimate your efforts.
Going to left field over here, ma'am.
Yeah, left field from a baseball perspective, not a crazy question. Please, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Carol Devine and I work with Médecins Sans Frontières, and I want to thank you for telling us more about the OECD, but also your work. My question is, given this incredible bird's eye view you have, and also with all these countries and people you interact with, what keeps you up at night, like of contemporary concerns? And what do you think, wow, this is going better than expected, or this is hopeful?
So in my job, but the one thing that keeps me up at night is really cybersecurity, because you never know when it's going to hit. You never know how it's going to hit. And no matter how much, it's the kind of thing you could invest every last euro you have, it'll never be enough. So you have to be nimble, you have to be, you know, really thinking ahead, and you've got to create internally that sense of responsibility and engagement so that people don't trivialize their role in that, because you're only one stick away from, you know, a virus coming in, and it's a real disaster, right? So that, from my perspective and my job, is what I worry about. What I worry about more globally, and when I look at our organization, I really worry about the fact that right now there are so many tipping points. If they all start to converge and, too many of them tip, it has the potential to really be disastrous.
What are those tipping points? What are you worried about?
Climate,
Yeah.
the war in Europe right now, protectionism. When you look, for example, at how certain countries are lifting restrictions on COVID and the pandemic and how it's not going well, that's also a tipping point that can have many other impacts, whether it's on supply chains, whether it's on a variety of things. I worry about rare metals. All of these things are things that, you think if it starts not going well, and I also worry about things like engineering, if, for example, cyber and pandemics, so flubola were to happen, what does that look like? AI, what does that look like? Now, where do I have hope? I actually, oops, sorry. Where do I have hope? I actually find that the resilience that we displayed throughout the pandemic globally is something that really sparked a lot of innovation. And I think that if we're able to use that to pivot, then the human spirit always comes through. And that spirit of cooperation and really wanting to connect, we're social animals, we want to connect. So if we're able to make that the currency, we can beat the rest.
That's a great note for which we can end, and thank Josée for joining us. And I invite you to join us after a really rousing round of applause for a reception just across the hall. Thank you so much.